So I've been looking into some of the stocks that are in the S&P 500, and there's a few that caught my eyes. I'm going to talk about one of them, Raytheon. Do you guys know about this company? It's a defense company, contractor company that manufactures missiles, all sorts of different weapons. Basically, its entire business is war. And it's in the S&P 500, which is really crazy because almost everybody owns a little piece of the S&P 500. It's the most common ETF to hold. And what you're doing basically is you're participating and funding companies that do things that are maybe not what you want to happen in the world, right? And if we actually look at the weighting here in the S&P 500, it is 0.37%. So that might seem like a small amount, but it's actually significant in the amount of money that it is allocated to from these funds. If you want to bring that up, Jor, that what I'm presenting.
Before I do, are we going to be in any sort of danger by sharing this?
Maybe. Maybe by the next one I'll talk about, which is number 44 here. So this is the 45th on S&P 500. 44 is Palantir, which is another defense company as well. Same weighting. So a huge amount of this portfolio or of all these passive investors are funding companies like this and a bunch of other companies that you really have no idea about. And I think that it's just we should kind of get into like what people are investing in with the number one recommended investment vehicle out there, which is the S&P 500.
Even Pepsi sells basically sugar. They sell diabetes, right? There's McDonald's, Coca-Cola, all these companies that are basically making profits from death, human misery, people being in a situation where they can't take care of themselves anymore, right? And they're essentially funding the healthcare industry. So it's almost like a circle where you invest in the S&P 500. The S&P 500 gives these companies a great way to fund themselves. Like we have MicroStrategy. They think about how many bonds they sold with their with their position in the stock market. They're not even in the S&P 500 yet. So how many of these companies do you think are doing things that we don't like, that we don't want to do, and we're passively funding them? We're giving them money. We're putting money in their pockets to do all these things, like killing other people, killing people we don't even know.
And they have a lot of power beyond that too. So it's not just what they're actually doing, but a large part of their business would be to continue to do what they're doing, which means lobbying efforts, getting in certain types of politicians that are going to vote for more spending if it's government contracts they have, or less regulation for certain types of food products or pharmaceuticals. Like all these things, it ends up being pretty corrupt system when you actually look at it, and pretty unethical. That's a big part about what was interesting to Bitcoin for me, was the ethics of it. There's nothing, I'm not hurting anybody else by owning Bitcoin, but by owning S&P, it's kind of a crazy thing to say, but you could make the argument that you're potentially doing bad in the world by funding these companies.
Yeah, just imagine how many people are out there right now potentially watching this. Not enough people probably watching this, but they go to work, they get half their salary taken off by income taxes, which is another major funding of war. Anytime you're giving income tax to the government, you're funding war in a roundabout way, or other nefarious things. But then they put their money into the pension. They let other people handle their investments because they don't really know what's going on. And so not only are they having to give up a portion of their salary to taxes to the government, but they're also funding it in a way that they probably don't even know about, which is through the S&P 500. So going off what Forrest was saying there, I 100% agree. This is the main thing that drew me to Bitcoin, is the fact that Bitcoiners are the only ones willing to have this conversation about the problem. This is a problem. And I think it's important to highlight. So we're going to talk about that during this episode today. And we're going to compare it to Bitcoin, because even though they're not apples to apples, stock market, Bitcoin, it is still a decision. Anytime you have any sort of excess capital in your life and you're allocating that, you get to decide how you allocate that. Are you putting it into the stock market? Are you putting it into Bitcoin, real estate? It's up to you. So even though they aren't similar per se, it's still part of the allocation here, either Bitcoin or stock market. So we're going to highlight a few things that most people probably aren't aware of.
Something that I thought that was really interesting is the fact that you're funding all these companies, you're getting a 10% return. You're basically just making up for inflation.
Right.
Yeah.
You're basically forced to buy these companies so that you can just keep your earnings.
Oh,
Exactly.
Right. That to me, that's crazy. That just when I think about how many people, so I used to post mostly about stocks and real estate, and I'd get a lot of comments from people who are saying how they don't want to invest in companies that are um, unethical, companies that are destroying the world, and Raytheon is one of those companies, right? And back then, of course, I didn't know about Bitcoin, so I didn't tell them about Bitcoin. I didn't tell them, hey, you should buy Bitcoin. But now that I know about it, I think it's my duty to tell them that Bitcoin is the only neutral asset, the only thing that doesn't want, let's say, a certain group of people to be dead or a certain group of people to be censored. Bitcoin is the only asset that allows us to do that. Bitcoin is the only savings vehicle that allows us to do that. Decentralized. When you can obviously say that gold works that way as well, but gold requires central parties in order to really work as a medium of exchange. But Bitcoin is the only thing that allows us to save money without funding the war machine or the diabetes machine or the sickness machine, right? Everything
pharma.
is pushed towards those industries, like pharma. So all those, everything that we do is basically to get us into supporting these companies, these industries, and then with Bitcoin, we finally find a way out.
And how are we rewarded for it is what you know, that's such a key point. Like, we're rewarded by funding these companies that are unethical by just beating inflation, maybe on a good year, you know? And the other thing too here is it's kind of like the S&P 500 is so overused by people because they don't want responsibility of choosing companies, and they just park their money in there, and it's passive in the way where it ranks the companies that you're allocated to by market cap. So this has been an effective way to pick the winners because the winners grow in size and the S&P will allocate to that more. But there's 500 companies in there, and oftentimes the stock market people talk about the Mag 7, the top 7 companies: Apple, Google, Amazon, Microsoft. And why aren't people just picking those then? There's 493 companies in there that don't perform as well. Why are they even allocating to those at all? It doesn't. The S&P 500, when you think about it, it's not passive in the way of it's choosing all these things for you. It's only passive in the market weighting index part of it. It's picking terrible companies for you to invest in overall.
Yeah, I think feels like exit liquidity for VCs.
Yeah,
that's part of it for sure. And the other thing I was going to say to this too, like, even if you don't give a damn about the ethical part about Bitcoin, like when we hear 10%, and I remember growing up when I was working with as a CPA, 10% was considered the average, a good above average return, 10%, which is fine. But until inflation is 10 or 12 or 15%, then you're not really making that much. It's not that much of a return. And when you compare it to Bitcoin's compound annual growth rate of 50 to 60%, you're not making anything. You're actually losing about 40%. So even if you don't care about the ethical part of this, it doesn't make any sort of sense to own this asset. And the majority of people in the world, or at least in North America, in the West here, do own this in one way or the other.
And one way that they've gotten away from this, it was very popular a couple of years ago, ESG investments. So that's environmental, social, and governance. Right. And so they would rank companies based on an ESG score. And what the problem with that is that can be gamed. So like Shell, for instance, has a pretty high ESG score because they are pretty good at governance within their own company. But they're terrible for the environment. It's a petroleum company, right? So if you care about one thing, if you care about, the ethics of investing, you're probably just going to buy an ESG type ETF because you don't know any better, thinking that, well, at least I'm supporting some good companies. And then they're terrible companies. So it's just been gamed. So there's no escape from it until something like that is ethical, like Bitcoin. I mean, even gold is not is not ethical either. It's destroying the world all over the place. People are mining in terrible types of conditions to acquire gold.
Yeah, and once gold's price goes up, people are going to go under the oceans to get to gold. They're going to destroy the entire floor of the ocean to get to gold, and they're going to do it for profits. I mean, you can't blame them, right? Because we have a broken financial system. We need something better. I think Bitcoin is the only solution. So this chart that I brought up here is it shows you three different things. So the first thing is the S&P 500. So let me get rid of Bitcoin and let me get rid of the S&P 500. So we can see here, the S&P 500 just keeps going straight up.
Mm-hmm.
It keeps going straight up. It almost looks like, I don't know, maybe what you guys give me your opinions here. It almost looks like this is rigged to go straight up, no matter what happens.
You know what it looks like to me is the opposite of the chart showing the dollar's decline. It's literally the opposite of that. And that's because those profits are directly in line with the debasement of the US dollar. So it is the inverse of the value of the dollar. Exactly that chart. It looks totally opposite of that.
So like this one right here. Yeah, exactly the opposite. It's just, if you look at it, one's going up and to the right, the other one's going down and to the right. That's it. But then if you include the Bitcoin price, the S&P 500's price is not even relevant. It's like there's nothing even there. It's just
like a flat line.
Yeah, there's nothing even there. And then if you go to include the S&P 500 priced in Bitcoin, I'll get rid of the other two just to get rid of the noise. You can see here, this is just crazy.
Wow.
It just keeps going lower and lower. So the S&P 500 is going to trend to zero in terms of Bitcoin forever, but people can't wrap their heads around it because it's just too difficult. They're too used to having the S&P 500 in their lives. They think because the S&P 500 is already at 6,000, it's going to go to 7,000, 8,000, 9,000. Of course, if you keep funding if you keep creating more US dollars and adding them to the economy, the S&P 500 will go up. But if you price the S&P 500 in something that can't be created out of nothing, it trends to zero forever, and it'll keep going lower and lower. Like if we look at the numbers here, at one point you could buy, what was it? I wish I could get rid of this thing. You could buy 10,500 Bitcoin with one share of the S&P 500.
Wow.
Could you imagine that? That's crazy.
You know what this makes me think? I think it was American Hodl that said this, but the S&P 500 stands for Standard and Poor's, which is like exactly what you don't want to be. You don't want to be standard and poor, and that's what it's going to make you over time. But you know what? I do think there's hope. I think there's hope. I think that maybe there will be a slight recovery eventually when all 500 companies use their growth engines of business to acquire Bitcoin. I think that's the only way out of it for the S&P 500 to not trend to zero against Bitcoin is full adoption of Bitcoin.
I do think a lot of the companies that are in the S&P 500 are going to get knocked out because they're not going to adopt a Bitcoin. And I think what you're saying is probably true, but I think we're going to go lower and lower though. I think we're going to go much, much lower before that happens, before people figure it out.
I agree with you there. Yeah, it's going to take time.
I mean, the S&P 500 today lost, what did I say it was, you guys? $1 trillion?
Yeah.
Oh, no, sorry. That was just the Meg 7. The Meg 7 today alone is down $1 trillion. And the total market cap of Bitcoin is what? Just above that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it just goes to show you when you're thinking about allocating and thinking about investing your own money, I think one of the key pieces too that we should touch on, I don't know the exact direction you guys were hoping to take this, but I think it is worth highlighting just how overvalued the stock market is in terms of people putting their money based on expectations, on speculation of assuming that things are going to continue like this forever. If you look at the PE ratio, and I think that because I don't really understand this stuff totally myself, I think that it's, I'm decent at, explaining this to people who are like me. So the price to earnings ratio of NVIDIA today, or NVIDIA, is 34.62 today, which is down actually from about a month ago after the big drop today. So 34.62, remember that. So the PE ratio basically means that it would take, if you bought a share in NVIDIA, it would take you 34 years to recoup 100% of that investment. 34 years. Right?
At their current earnings.
At their current earnings today. And if you compare that to Bitcoin, I know it's not apples to apples. One's a stock, one's an asset here, I guess you'd say, or more of a commodity. But Bitcoin's would be about 2 because the compound annual return on Bitcoin is 50%. So if you bought Bitcoin, it would take 2 years to get 100% of your investment back, essentially. So that is a huge, huge gap. And when people think about like the NAV premiums that people are paying on Strategy or on Metaplanet or on Summer Scientific, they're absolutely insignificant to like Nvidia, Tesla, Apple. The PE ratios don't even make sense. It's just because so many people just do it without even knowing that they're investing in these companies. And as you guys said, it's like an endless loop of just funding these companies to continue to grow without anything really there. It's all based on future expectations, which who knows? Will it trend to zero? Will it go up? I don't know. If I was a gambling man, I would say that any companies not holding Bitcoin are going to trend towards zero.
If something I was thinking about not too long ago is the floor price of every company is going to be whatever their Bitcoin holdings are. Right.
Yeah,
So over
right.
time, all these companies are going to continue to trend to zero until, let's say, for example, at some point, Apple is one of the most profitable companies in the world. Let's say they buy 1 Bitcoin and they stop. The value of their company is going to trend to zero until it goes down to 1 Bitcoin. Right.
Yeah.
That's just how Bitcoin works. That's just how competition works. That's how markets work.
Right.
Like I said, let's say MicroStrategy, their lowest price can be 500,000 Bitcoin, 520,000 Bitcoin, or whatever. Over time, we're going to see more and more companies accumulating Bitcoin, and they're going to trend towards that Bitcoin price. Maybe we'll have a multiple with people wanting to get exposure to their cash flows. I think they're going to trend to zero until they hit their Bitcoin holding.
Yeah, well, you're right. I mean, that's their liquidation price, right? So if somebody came into a business and wanted to liquidate it, said, hey, you have no future as a business, they're going to sell off everything, and it comes down to their floor price of what their assets are worth, right? So that's why people say MSTR has a MNAV of 2.04, which means that its market cap is basically double what its Bitcoins were. If it was liquidated right now, all the bondholders would get paid out, probably cash, not Bitcoin, but for the amount of net assets they have. And all these other assets that these companies have are not worth much over time. They're going to continue to trend to zero. And if they don't put Bitcoin on their balance sheet, they won't have anything of real worth.
I think that's the key here is like real. And that's why this show is titled Stocks Are Fake. That's the thumbnail, I believe, on this one. So stocks are fake. And that's what you have to really keep in mind here when you're thinking through this stuff. What can be created? Everything except, again, going back to these 3 things that I think of as Bitcoin, like precious, scarce, valuable farmland and oceanfront property. So if you think about real versus fake, we kind of talked about, and I kind of just had this realization this week, is that there's going to come a point where people just stop accepting fiat in exchange for Bitcoin. I think that most Bitcoiners would agree with that statement at some point. I don't know when it'll be, but at some point, because one's fake, one can be created, one's real, one cannot be created. So when you think about that, you say, okay, well, how can I obtain Bitcoin in the future then? And you think, well, I'm either going to have to trade my time and my energy for it, or I'm going to have to trade another real asset for it, right? That's kind of the 2 things. But when you think about where the world's moving to right now, and you think about AI, and you think about robots, and the measurement of humans' skills and time is going to go down forever because of that, because we're now competing against robots and AI. So in the future, the value of humans is going to go down versus what it is today. So you're not going to get much for that. You might be able to get some, but it's going to go down forever. So then you think about, okay, so then I can trade some real assets for Bitcoin. What's a real asset though? At that point, what are people going to want to trade for Bitcoin? Gold? Probably not. Stocks? Definitely not. Vehicles, maybe if you need it. But the point is that as this thing goes on and the fake continues to separate from the real, it's going to get very, very hard to accumulate any sort of position of Bitcoin. That's kind of my thesis on this.
Yeah. Electricity. That's what you're going to need to trade. Energy,
right.
Yeah.
I wanted to bring this up just to support your point there, Jor. The wage in terms of dollars is continuing to go up. Bitcoin's price obviously is going up way faster, but then if you get rid of the wage, if you convert the wage into Bitcoin, it's just going straight down, straight down. There's no recovery here. You're never going to go back up to, let's say, at some point you were making 407,000 Bitcoin per year. That was the annual wage if you calculate it in terms of Bitcoin. But today it's at like 1 Bitcoin.
And it makes sense, right? Because if you're somebody out there who's doing a job and you make like 70 or 80K salary annually, and now your job can be done by an AI or a robot, of course, our value here is going to continue to trend towards zero forever. And so not only the products that these big companies are creating, the S&P companies that they're creating, you can make more of these easily, and it's going to become easier and easier as technology improves to be able to create these products. But our value as humans is going to continue to go down as well. So at a time where that happens, where people stop trading their real stuff for fake stuff, the amount of sats that you're going to be able to obtain for whatever you're trading is just going to trend towards zero. And that includes stocks.
Yeah. Yeah. What you were saying there, Forrest, you were mentioning the price of energy, oil price. If you look at it in terms of US dollars, it's pretty much steady. But then in terms of Bitcoin, well, not steady, it's volatile, but it's not as, it doesn't go up, or it does. Yeah, it doesn't go up, at least, because oil can be produced. You can make more oil. There's basically, I mean, from what I know, there's unlimited oil that we have access to. But in terms of Bitcoin, it's just going straight down.
There's a high flow ratio to the stock of oil.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And I mean, it's going down, which is the way it should, because like you said, the supply demand dynamics, there's more supply being added, same demand, or it fluctuates day to day, week to week, but it's decreasing like in value compared to something with better supply demand dynamics, which is Bitcoin. It can be really that simple.
And even with oil, I think oil would be probably one of the most the closest correlation to Bitcoin that we've seen, because it is energy. I think that's an important point to make, that oil is energy. But the thing about oil right now is that we've lived in a world where oil has been artificially capped in terms of they pretend that it's a really scarce asset, when if you go on Google Maps and you look at Antarctica, the beaches in Antarctica are literal coal, which means there's oil under there. So in the sense that we're aware of, yes, oil is a scarce asset, but in reality, the earth literally produces oil. What? Yeah, I'll maybe stop there. I don't want to get too far off the rails in terms of.
Well, the other thing too is it's artificially been kept high as well in price.
Right.
Like old Uncle Carney or whatever his name is, reduced the carbon tax here in Canada to zero. So for 10 years, we've been paying 15-20% more than we needed to, which is an input cost, right? Energy and oil are input costs to everything else. So it makes everything else more expensive. So, we've had all this problem with inflation and everything like that. It's like, what's the one commonality that drives the cost up of everything? It's energy. So why don't we lower our artificially expensive oil to reduce inflation? It would be the best thing to do.
Even food is energy.
Yes.
Right. You need food to survive. If you don't have food, then you're not going to survive. But in terms of Bitcoin, the price of food is going down. We saw the CPI. We saw there's a price of steak. There's a price of the Big Mac.
Well, oil is a huge input to food because of fertilizer. The fertilizer is created through a byproduct of oil, or process of oil, basically.
And then transportation too.
Exactly. It's a major input for everything.
Huge.
Yeah.
Pretty interesting here, boys. Is there anything else we want to touch on in terms of stocks are fake?
Actually, let's go back to why the S&P 500 is going to go to zero. It's because everything that these companies are producing are basically things that you can produce at will. You can produce them at any point, or you can keep producing more and more. I actually think that there's going to be more competition from small businesses over time that are going to take down these S&P 500 companies. So I do think that the S&P 500 is going to trend to zero forever. I
What?
do think that. I
Go a
genuinely
little. Sorry, Rajat. Go a little bit further on that. Why do you think that small businesses are going to be able to compete with these companies because of Bitcoin?
So these companies that are, let's say you have a business that you're making from your house. You have a grocery business, for example. You don't have to pay for transaction fees. You don't have to pay for like franchise fees, for example. You don't have to pay for your executives who are taking tons of money out of your system, out of your money, out of your
Admin
company.
costs.
Exactly. You may not have to pay for shareholder dividends, right? All these things can factor into you building a business that competes with these massive S&P 500 companies. Let's say you start a grocery store and you can build it up. You can keep building it and building it until it actually competes with Walmart in your area.
And I think the other thing too that Bitcoin allows for is that it literally unlocks the worldwide economy now, where somebody in some random country can produce something now that could never sell it to the world before Bitcoin. And why? Because they needed a bank account. For me to send them money for their product, they would have to have a bank account. And a lot of these citizens in these countries do not have bank accounts. And I'm not saying anyways, I can't speak for you guys, but I'm not saying that this is going to happen in the next couple of years. But over time, as technology improves, as this worldwide market continues to open up, it will be competition for some of these larger companies. And you have to assume that the way the technology is going now, most people at some point will have a 3D printer, maybe not in their house, but on their block. Somebody will have one where they can print a lot of these things that these bigger companies have made profits from in the past.
I think the other thing that I want to touch on here is just the S&P 500 is something people buy when they don't want to think about investing. It's something they buy that they believe they can sleep easy at night owning. And there's so many variables within there. You don't know any of the companies you're invested in minus a handful. And they're all perceived valuable based on their forward cash flow, which is their PE ratio. And that can fluctuate like crazy based on global economics and all that. And then it's still like the argument that so many people have about Bitcoin, that it's only what somebody else is willing to pay for it, is the same argument for stocks. It's really like, people are evaluating these stocks based on all these metrics like PE, but that doesn't really mean anything. It doesn't mean anything until you sell it. Like, the only thing you really get from a stock is voting rights, and then you probably own such a small percentage that vote doesn't matter anyway. And then you can, if it pays dividends, it's basically like extracting some of the capital that they hold and giving that back to you. It's almost like you're selling a portion of your ownership every time they pay dividends. But that's it, right? Like what do you own with the stock? You actually don't even own the stock. The brokerage owns the stock. You never actually receive ownership of it. Mm-hmm. So Bitcoin is different than that. You can own it, and the value of it is that it is money. You're not looking at the forward earnings. The price of it in US dollars goes up and down based on people's perception of, will this be successful as an alternate monetary network, which it has already proven that it is. And we can see more and more evidence every single day that it's trending in the direction of that. So, I sleep way easier knowing that I own Bitcoin rather than not knowing what I own by owning the S&P 500.
Yeah.
I think that the other thing too, there's a lot of people just invest in the stock market because it's part of their pension. And yes, there is some friction there in terms of taking capital out of your pension, out of your stock account, and putting it into Bitcoin. But because now we have things like the Bitcoin ETF, which is fairly new, it's only about a year old now, plus Strategy, plus these other companies who are actually holding Bitcoin, which will be the new floor for these companies in the future. So you can, even if you don't want to go through the hoops and the learning curve of taking full custody of this asset, there are very easy, low friction ways where you can get access to the Bitcoin price exposure through an ETF, through Strategy, through some of these other companies who are holding Bitcoin. I'd say ETFs is probably the easiest. The other companies might need a little bit more of your time to look into them. But either way, like, there's no friction here anymore. If you want access to Bitcoin, you want exposure to it, you now can without having to cash out of the system. Yeah.
And know that you can sell the ETFs and transfer that into actual ownership of Bitcoin. And if you've been holding the ETFs, you're allocated to the price appreciation of that Bitcoin. So it's an easy one-to-one transfer at that point, once you've learned self-custody or your different custody solution, which will likely be better than owning the ETF.
100%. So is that, you got any more thoughts, fellas, or should we wrap this one?
I think I'm good.
Okay.
All good.
Cool. So that QR code right beside Forrest's head there, that is our Maple Bitcoin Lambo Fund. And for the Bitcoiners who are watching this, I know there's probably some people who are more heavily allocated to the stock market, but for the Bitcoiners who made it this far in the video, if you would like to support the channel here, we would appreciate it. We plan on remaining ad-free, retain our voices here. It's important to us. So that's a good way that you can contribute and help support this channel using that QR code. And the last thing I would say is that the Meg 7 is down $1 trillion today. There's a lot of fear out there. There's a lot of worry. We just posted a video on the channel talking about for people who are worried about Bitcoin. So you can check that one out right now. It should be somewhere around our heads right here. And yeah, that's it, fellas. Thanks for another great episode here. And we'll catch you on the next one. A little early there for us, but good enough. See you, boys.